The pre-revolutionary Russian Empire stood as an immense land of contrasts, where wealth and privilege coexisted uneasily with widespread poverty and deprivation. Stretching across 11 time zones, it was a sprawling mosaic of ethnicities, religions, and languages. Yet, beneath the surface of this vast empire lay systemic inequalities that would ultimately destabilize the regime. At the heart of Russian society was an agrarian economy dominated by feudal structures. Despite the abolition of serfdom in 1861, millions of peasants remained tethered to the land, living in conditions that bordered on medieval. They worked small plots, often heavily indebted to landowners or the state, struggling to survive under an inefficient and exploitative agricultural system. These peasants constituted the overwhelming majority of the population, nearly 80%, but their plight went largely ignored by the aristocracy and czarist government. In the cities, the situation was no less dire. Industrialization had taken root late in Russia compared to Western Europe, and its rapid and uneven expansion brought its own set of problems. Factories sprang up in urban centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg, employing a burgeoning working class. However, the workers faced grueling conditions: long hours, low wages, and little to no legal protections. Strikes and protests became increasingly common, signaling growing unrest among this new class of industrial laborers. Politically, Tsar Nicholas II presided over an autocratic regime that resisted reform. Power was concentrated in the hands of the monarch, supported by a small circle of aristocrats and bureaucrats. The Duma, a legislative body created after the 1905 revolution, was little more than a token concession, frequently dissolved whenever it challenged the Tsar's authority. Censorship was pervasive, and political opposition was ruthlessly suppressed, with dissidents sent to Siberia or executed. Despite its repressive nature, the Tsarist government failed to address the growing demand for political participation, land reform, and better working conditions. Revolutionary ideas, imported from Europe, began to spread among the intelligentsia and working classes. Marxism, anarchism, and other radical ideologies found fertile ground in a population disillusioned by decades of inequality and repression. Externally, the empire faced mounting pressures. Military defeats in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 humiliated Russia on the global stage, exposing the weaknesses of its military and industrial base. The war also drained resources, further exacerbating economic difficulties. These failures ignited the Revolution of 1905, a precursor to the upheavals of 1917, during which workers, peasants, and intellectuals joined forces in a broad challenge to the regime. Although the government managed to suppress the movement, the events of 1905 revealed the depth of popular discontent and the fragility of the Tsarist system. By the early 20th century, the contradictions of the Russian Empire had become too great to ignore. A rigid social hierarchy, an inflexible political structure, and a burgeoning crisis in both the countryside and the cities set the stage for a transformative upheaval. The tensions simmered, waiting for the right moment to erupt into full-scale revolution. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 plunged the Russian Empire into a catastrophic spiral, exposing the fragility of its economy, governance, and military structure. Initially greeted with patriotic fervor, the war soon revealed itself to be an unmitigated disaster for the empire. The Russian military, ill-prepared and poorly equipped, suffered humiliating defeats at the hands of the better-organized German forces. By 1917, millions of Russian soldiers had perished, and those who survived often did so in harrowing conditions, lacking adequate food, clothing, and ammunition. On the home front, the war exacerbated existing tensions in a society already stretched thin by decades of inequality and inefficiency. Russia's infrastructure, never robust, began to collapse under the demands of prolonged conflict. The transportation network faltered, making it increasingly difficult to deliver supplies to the front or food to the cities. Grain piled up in rural areas, while urban populations faced shortages that spiraled into hunger and desperation. Prices for basic goods soared, and inflation eroded the already meager wages of the working class. The monarchy's inability to manage the crisis became painfully evident. Tsar Nicholas II, taking personal command of the army in 1915, left the capital under the administration of Tsarina Alexandra and her increasingly unpopular confidant, Grigory Rasputin. This decision not only failed to improve the military situation but also further alienated the population. Alexandra's German heritage and Rasputin's perceived influence over state matters fueled rumors and resentment, eroding what little trust remained in the monarchy. Discontent spread across all segments of society. In the countryside, peasants grew increasingly restive, angered by the loss of sons to the war and the lack of tangible benefits from their sacrifices. Urban workers, subjected to longer hours and deteriorating conditions in war factories, became hotbeds of revolutionary sentiment. Even within the military, the backbone of the regime, morale crumbled as soldiers faced unimaginable hardships with little hope of victory. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, Russia's war effort was on the brink of collapse. The empire's vast resources had been squandered in a conflict it was ill-equipped to sustain, leaving its economy in ruins and its population disillusioned. Strikes, protests, and mutinies erupted across the empire, signaling that the war had not only failed to unite the nation but had also driven it to the brink of revolution. For Russia, World War I acted not as a rallying point but as a catalyst for systemic failure, accelerating the fractures that would lead to the empire's downfall. The February Revolution of 1917 erupted against a backdrop of widespread discontent and systemic failure, marking a decisive turning point in Russian history. What began as a localized protest quickly transformed into a nationwide upheaval, fueled by years of economic hardship, political repression, and the unrelenting toll of World War I. The revolution was sparked in Petrograd, where severe food shortages and harsh winter conditions drove workers and housewives to the streets in protest. Initial demonstrations over bread soon grew into broader strikes, drawing thousands of factory workers and laborers. Over the course of several days, the protests intensified, paralyzing the city. Calls for bread evolved into demands for an end to the war and the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. The unrest spread rapidly, propelled by a convergence of social groups. Women played a critical role in the early stages, particularly on International Women's Day, when they rallied male workers to join the protests. Soldiers, many of whom were peasant conscripts weary from the war, began to defy orders to fire on demonstrators. Instead, entire regiments mutinied, joining the crowds and bringing with them weapons and military discipline. The Tsar's power base disintegrated as the army, long considered the bedrock of the regime, turned against him. In the capital, the collapse of authority was swift. Government officials struggled to contain the crisis, but key institutions crumbled under the pressure. Striking workers shut down factories, and transportation ground to a halt. The police, overwhelmed and demoralized, abandoned their posts. Petrograd descended into chaos, but it was a chaos with purpose, a collective outcry against the Tsarist regime and its inability to meet the needs of its people. By mid-March, Tsar Nicholas II faced no viable path to retain power. Isolated and without the support of his generals, he reluctantly abdicated on March 15, marking the end of more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. In his place, a provisional government was established, composed of liberal politicians and moderate socialists. The new government promised reforms and a more democratic political system, but it inherited a nation in turmoil, beset by war, famine, and unresolved social grievances. The February Revolution did not bring immediate stability. While it succeeded in toppling the autocracy, it left unresolved questions about Russia's future. Power remained contested, as workers' councils, or Soviets, emerged as an alternative source of authority, advocating more radical changes than the provisional government was prepared to offer. The revolution set the stage for a broader struggle over the shape and direction of Russia's political, social, and economic order, with implications that would reverberate far beyond the country's borders. The October Revolution of 1917 was a carefully orchestrated and decisive moment that saw the Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, seized control of the Russian state. By autumn, the political landscape was dominated by chaos and uncertainty. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, had failed to address the urgent demands for peace, land, and bread, leaving it increasingly isolated and ineffective. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks capitalized on growing dissatisfaction, presenting themselves as the only force capable of delivering revolutionary change. Throughout October, the Bolsheviks worked methodically to consolidate their influence, particularly within the Soviets, grassroots councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants that had become alternative centers of power. The slogan, "All Power to the Soviets," resonated with the masses, who were disillusioned with the provisional government and its continued commitment to the war. The Bolsheviks' disciplined party structure, propaganda, and promises of radical reform positioned them as a credible alternative. On the night of October 25th, Julian calendar, the Bolsheviks launched their coup in Petrograd. Under the strategic direction of Leon Trotsky, who commanded the Petrograd Soviet's Military Revolutionary Committee, armed workers and soldiers took control of key locations across the city, including bridges, telegraph offices, and train stations. The assault on the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was headquartered, symbolized the final act of the insurrection. Meeting little resistance, the Bolsheviks captured the palace and arrested members of the government. By the following morning, Lenin declared the overthrow of the provisional government and the transfer of power to the Soviets. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, convening simultaneously, ratified the Bolsheviks' actions. Lenin's first decrees outlined the new government's priorities: immediate peace negotiations to end Russia's involvement in World War I, the redistribution of land to peasants, and the establishment of workers' control over factories. These measures, while ambitious, reflected the demands of a war-weary and impoverished population. The October Revolution was not without its challenges. The Bolsheviks faced resistance from other socialist factions and elements of the old regime, and their initial hold on power was tenuous. However, their ability to deliver decisive, populist measures in the days that followed solidified their legitimacy among key segments of the population. The revolution marked the beginning of a dramatic experiment in socialist governance, with the establishment of a government led by the Bolsheviks under the banner of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. The events of October 1917 represented not only a seizure of power but also a radical redefinition of governance and society. The Bolsheviks' success was rooted in their ability to harness the demands of workers, peasants, and soldiers while presenting a vision of a radically transformed state. This revolution would soon ripple across the globe, inspiring and alarming observers far beyond Russia's borders. The impact of the Russian Revolution transcended national borders, reshaping not only the social, political, and economic structures within Russia but also influencing the trajectory of global history. Its immediate consequence was the establishment of the world's first socialist state, a radical experiment that challenged existing political norms and inspired both hope and fear worldwide. Domestically, the revolution dismantled centuries of czarist autocracy and feudalism. The Bolsheviks implemented sweeping reforms aimed at transforming society along socialist lines. The redistribution of land to peasants broke the back of feudal land ownership, while the nationalization of industries placed production under state control. These measures were designed to align with Marxist principles, though they often collided with the realities of a deeply agrarian and war-torn nation. The creation of Soviets as grassroots organs of governance symbolized a profound shift toward worker and peasant representation, even as the Bolsheviks consolidated power into a one-party state. The revolution's ripple effects extended far beyond Russia. For oppressed and colonized peoples, it offered a model of resistance against imperialism and capitalism. Movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America drew inspiration from the Bolshevik example, framing their struggles as part of a larger global revolution. The Comintern, established in 1919, became the conduit through which Soviet ideology and support flowed to communist parties worldwide, fueling revolts, strikes, and uprisings. In Europe, the revolution heightened class tensions and emboldened socialist movements. In countries like Germany, Hungary, and Italy, workers and soldiers established Soviet-style councils, threatening existing governments. The fear of a red contagion prompted the ruling classes to take drastic measures, including the rise of fascist regimes, which framed themselves as bulwarks against communism. At the same time, the revolution deepened ideological divides that would define the 20th century. The Bolsheviks' success challenged the capitalist order, compelling liberal democracies to confront the appeal of socialism to their own working classes. The revolution was a catalyst for the ideological polarization that culminated in the Cold War, where the Soviet Union emerged as the primary antagonist to the Western Bloc. Economically, the revolution introduced a new model of development, emphasizing central planning and state ownership. While its implementation faced significant challenges, the Soviet system presented itself as an alternative to capitalism during a period marked by economic instability and the Great Depression. The Soviet Union's rapid industrialization in the 1930s, though achieved at great human cost, showcased the potential of a state-driven economy to many observers. Culturally, the revolution ignited debates about art, education, and the role of the state in shaping intellectual life. Soviet cultural policies, including support for avant-garde art and later socialist realism, sought to align cultural production with revolutionary ideals. This cultural shift, though often constrained by political agendas, fostered an environment where artists and intellectuals grappled with questions of social responsibility and the relationship between art and politics. The Russian Revolution was not just a moment of upheaval. It was a seismic shift that reverberated through every aspect of global society. It redefined notions of governance, economic organization, and social justice, leaving a legacy that continues to inform political discourse and inspire movements to this day. The Russian Revolution, while often portrayed as a singular event, was marked by profound tensions and contradictions within its own ranks. These tensions reflected the divergent visions for the future of Russia and revealed the complexities of forging a revolutionary state amidst widespread social and economic turmoil. At the heart of these conflicts was the uneasy alliance between urban workers, represented largely by the Bolsheviks, and the rural peasantry. While the Bolsheviks advocated for socialist policies grounded in Marxist theory, these policies often prioritized industrial workers and urban centers over the predominantly agrarian population. The peasants, who constituted the vast majority of the population, sought immediate land redistribution and autonomy over their livelihoods. The Bolshevik decree on land, which sanctioned peasant seizures of estates, temporarily aligned these interests, but underlying contradictions persisted. The collectivization policies that emerged later highlighted the friction between the state's vision of socialism and the peasantry's desire for independent land ownership. Within the Bolshevik Party itself, ideological debates underscored internal divisions. Lenin's vision of a tightly centralized, vanguard-led government clashed with the more democratic aspirations of some party members who advocated for broader worker control and local Soviet autonomy. Figures like Alexandra Kollontai and the workers' opposition criticized the emerging bureaucracy and argued for greater proletarian democracy within the party. These debates, while vigorously contested, were ultimately suppressed as Lenin and later Stalin consolidated power. The revolution also faced challenges from competing socialist factions, notably the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries. Both groups had significant support bases, particularly among workers and peasants, and presented alternative visions for Russia's future. The Mensheviks favored a more gradual transition to socialism through parliamentary means, while the Socialist Revolutionaries prioritized agrarian reform. The Bolsheviks' decision to dissolve the Constituent Assembly in January 1918, after it failed to deliver a Bolshevik majority, starkly illustrated their willingness to sideline democratic processes to maintain control. Another major source of tension emerged in the form of national minorities within the empire. The Bolsheviks' initial promise of self-determination appealed to non-Russian nationalities, many of whom sought independence or greater autonomy. However, as the Civil War unfolded, the Bolsheviks' need to maintain territorial integrity often conflicted with these aspirations. This led to a complex relationship between Moscow and various nationalist movements, where promises of autonomy were frequently overridden by the realities of centralization. The tensions extended into the military and societal realms. The Red Army, formed to defend the revolution, faced significant challenges in maintaining discipline and loyalty, particularly as it recruited from a population deeply divided in its allegiances. In urban areas, workers' councils, Soviets, sometimes clashed with Bolshevik leaders over control of production and decision-making, as workers resisted efforts to impose centralized directives on local industries. These tensions were not mere distractions but fundamental dilemmas inherent to the revolutionary process. They reflected the competing demands of theory and practice, the divergence between immediate needs and long-term goals, and the challenge of forging unity in a nation deeply fragmented by class, ethnicity, and geography. The Russian Revolution was as much a struggle within itself as it was against external enemies, revealing the complexities of revolutionary transformation in a diverse and fractured society. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. And do not forget, subscribe to the knowledge.